966.
We are speaking now with Mohammed Soliman, who is the director of MEI's Strategic Technologies and Cybersecurity Program, a manager at McLarty Associates Middle East and North Africa practice. His work focuses on the intersection of technology, geopolitics, and business in the Middle East and North Africa. Mohammed frequently appears on Arabic and English language television to provide commentary on unfolding events in the Middle East. Mohammed, nice to see you. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
I feel like we should give some background, because you were just recently named director of the Middle East Institute Strategic Technology and Cybersecurity Program. Mabruk, congratulations! It's a big deal. I got to know you, and we got to know you as in your gig as manager at McLarty Associates, and we should give a shout out to our friend Ali Tolba, who is your colleague over at McLarty and a really seasoned hand, who I think a lot of us sort of turn to for insight and guidance, and he's played a big role, and that's how I met you. I met you through Ali. But I also wanted to talk a little bit about how here you are talking about cyber and tech and digital and these sorts of things, but you were destined to be an engineer, yes?
I am a trained engineer. I worked as engineer at the beginning of my career. So I'm born and raised in Cairo. Did school of engineering. First job after graduation was Microsoft Tech Lab. Did engineering work for many years of my life, and then switched to policy. I went to Georgetown School of Foreign Service, studied tech policy and cyber policy, finished grad school, worked in consulting, again, with very big focus on tech. And then here I am leading a tech program at the Middle East Institute, working on tech decoupling, tech competition in the Middle East, how to think about the Middle East in a new framework that goes beyond energy. So I think it's all connected. I think engineering, my engineering background has been very helpful navigating these new elements of policy.
Well, and it's timely for us on the 966. We look for and have been fortunate enough to host guests. Just last week, Bilal Saab was talking about a new way to look at the relationship, the defense relationship beyond energy, and some of the things that have been the case in the past. You've written a series of articles that I think is really interesting, and what really prompted us to invite you on the show. And maybe you can walk us through this, because you're dealing with I think issues that are poorly understood but are just critical to these countries. We'll talk about Saudi Arabia with the Gulf, critical to the countries as they plot their national strategies going forward. And let's start. You wrote a series of 3 articles, and I know you've added a 4th. We might bring it in later. One is they call the Middle East in an era of great tech competition, tech decoupling, which you just referred to. The other is the Gulf is a 5G conundrum, and this is where you talk about radio access network. And the third, it's time for a Saudi-U.S. tech dialogue. So, can you tell us what is the great tech decoupling?
So let me set a framework here to think about the Middle East, and then we're going to have a deeper dive and answer your question. So why we're thinking about tech in the Middle East? I think part of it is this region is not only on the rise because of economic/fiscal surplus, but also it's a region that's going through massive transformation. I'm based in Saudi right now. Saudi is not just the Gulf biggest economy. It's a G20 economy. It's a $800 billion GDP, biggest surplus in the GCC / Middle East. They are directing their own finances towards digital transformation. So they're the biggest buyer and biggest optimizers of high-end tech these days. Same thing applies to the UAE, Abu Dhabi, and Dubai. Same thing applies to Qatar. So focusing on tech in the Middle East is not really a luxury. It's actually part of understanding this new Gulf. I call it a new Gulf. It's a Gulf that's a bit different than 1970s, 1980s, even 1990s Gulf, that still people think about it as is stuck in time. This is not really the same region. This is not really the same countries. So back to your first question, what's a tech decoupling? For the last 30 years, since the downfall of the Soviet Union, you had a global hegemon, this is the United States. And this country has been the guardian of new norms, liberal international order. You have globalization on the rise. This is the new norm. So tech was integrated into that. Tech is more about free flow of capital, people, and IP. I would say IP is the most important part. Intellectual property has been disseminated around the world. You had tech has been integrated series of supply chain that's very dispersed across different regions, from East Asia to South Asia to Israel to Europe to United States, all integrated. But this has been the past. I would say somewhere in the last 10 years, the status of the United States as the only power has changed. You have clear competition coming from Beijing, and I would say to a lesser extent from Moscow. But let's say Beijing is the most important competitor the United States has at the moment. And that meant that decision makers in Washington decided that whatever system they built in the last 30 years that enabled the rise of China, we need to change that. And changing that means decoupling. So what decoupling means? That means you're going to weaponize, I'm going to be very blunt, we're going to weaponize choke points in the tech ecosystem to the national interest of the United States. What does it mean in real terms? It means if you have 5G network and you have Chinese tech companies like Huawei or ZTE, we're going to tell our own allies and partners through an initiative that was launched under the Trump administration and Secretary Pompeo, is called the Clean Network Initiative. If you want to be in good terms with the United States, you cannot use Chinese technology. That's basically, this is a core to our own bilateral relationship. And it succeeded. And on top of that, you add some sanctions on Huawei and ZTE's access to U.S. Semiconductors. So you also not only exclude them from markets, you also slow down their progression. That was the 5G. And this is why 5G was very important to the tech decoupling, because this was the biggest fight between China and the United States. When you have Trump team saying tech is fundamental to our national security, tech is fundamental to U.S. primacy, we need to maintain dominance, and we need to slow down the Chinese. So this is what happened in the 5G. Under the Biden team, not only they follow through on this sort of trajectory, they built on it, they expanded it, they made it expand to different sets of technologies. So last October, you had the export control on semiconductors. You had National Security Advisor Sullivan releasing the export control, which is very clear. The United States decided that AI-powered semiconductors we're not going to export that to China. We're also going to tell our own allies and partners, specifically in Tokyo and Amsterdam, that they also have to join us in this sort of effort. Same thing is going to be in AI and biotechnology. So it's much more expansive field when you have tech decoupling taking place. Not only Washington is doing it, is also bringing allies and partners on board with us. So back to the original story. So why we need to care about tech decoupling in the Gulf, ASEAN, emerging markets? Because everyone is consuming tech. All the tech that you are using or you're buying is a result of a certain system that existed 30 years ago that was based on interdependence. This system is right now is crumbling, and you have to navigate these weird times without really angering the two parties and making sure that you are also prioritizing your national interest and your economic interest in this process. So that's basically my long answer to your question.
That's an excellent overview, excellent answer, and that gives a terrific context. So let's bring it down to the national level, Saudi Arabia, UAE, the Gulf, and that sort of thing. What is tech sovereignty?
So I've been writing about tech sovereignty when it was not really a trendy term at all. That was like 5 years ago. So what's a tech sovereignty? It's treating tech as a medium where the governments or the sovereigns, where the rulers of the land need to exert their own sovereignty in this medium. And this medium could be space, could be sea, could be land, but also could be tech. So what I mean by tech, it means data. And tech sovereignty started because of the West, not as a response to the West. Meaning, I would argue that emerging markets in general, from Brazil to Nigeria to Egypt, Saudi Arabia to Indonesia, the moment they woke up to the 2016 elections in the United States, add to that the allegations of Russian interference in the election, add to that some questions about how some US companies treating data. When you had all of these sorts of dynamics happening in the United States, and then the EU responds to that by the GDPR, which is their data regulation, talking about how to treat data of EU citizens. I think it gave a cause and it gave a framework to other nations and other countries to think about their own data/tech sovereignty. So how we as emerging West, how we as G20 nations, we as countries that have much more better position than 50 years ago or 40 years ago, how should we think about our own sovereignty in the tech space? And it started with data. I think the first field where countries started thinking about was data. Part of it, the EU started this process with the GDPR, and then they started using GDPR as an intellectual framework, as a legal framework for how they treat data of their own citizens. So now you hear everyone, I would say everyone in the emerging markets in the global south is going to refer to GDPR as a benchmark for how the citizens' data should be treated in terms of cross-border data transfer. There's no free flow of data without some sort of oversight or regulations or agreed upon rules between countries. So you started to have a different or a new element in bilateral relations. For example, you have the EU-US cross-border data agreement. Now you have the US and UE have a cross-border data agreement, or at least the beginning of. That countries are thinking about data as part of the bilateral relationship, not really as something that's free for all, that's accessible as a default feature. So data is the underlined feature, which makes sense because data is the most important element of the tech ecosystem. And you add to that other elements. You have the 5G. Okay, so there's a big fight between China and the United States over 5G. The Americans are banning Huawei and ZTE from their own networks, asking allies and partners to exclude Huawei. So how should we think about that? Well, so let's go back to the original story of what's 5G. 5G is a next generation network, faster, is going to be the benchmark enabler of Internet of Things, the tech integration between societal elements, private sector, government, military, is going to basically multiply your growth and enhance your societal productivity, many things underlined under this 5G framework. So what's 5G? 5G, as you mentioned, it's a box that has a software, hardware, and transmit these data. The thing is, it was always a closed system. So when you go to a vendor like Huawei or Nokia or Ericsson, you buy the whole system. It's not really something where you're able to pick and choose software, hardware from different vendors. It was a closed ecosystem. So the Open RAN initiatives, because there are multiple initiatives, are all about diversifying the vendors, not relying on one single vendor. So you're able, first of all, to bring some elements of your own tech champions into this game. So if you're an emerging market, you care about having one of your tech companies to be part of this process. You also are able to pick and choose between companies and countries, by extension. And you also avoid this whole idea of picking sides in this fight. So you have the Gulf, and this is back to the article that you mentioned. You have a Gulf Open RAN initiative that has all the Gulf telecos part of it. And they actually, last year in 2022, they released their first white paper talking about Open RAN integration, opportunities, challenges, the Gulf dynamics. Again, it's very, I would say, very refreshing to see that the Gulf is not only recipient of tech, they're actually active participants. They have their own capabilities. They also have their own economic priorities, and they're able to navigate that on their own terms.
It's fascinating. It's an echo of what's going on at the political level in terms of, post-Ukraine and post-invasion of Ukraine, in terms of Saudi Arabia and many countries sort of staking out a middle region between one side and the other, and trying, the term is hedging, but, trying to maintain key relationships with countries around the globe and not just be completely aligned with one or the other. So when Saudi Arabia looks at this, and they are in the midst of, I think they've just launched a personal data law, and I know they really struggled with this. Is it fully together? Is it something, because this is critical in terms of investment? It's obviously critical preserving your data, the integrity of your data, and the security issues. But you also have to have an environment where people want to come and do business. Have they hit it with this personal data plan?
So they launched something called the PDBL, the Personal Data Law, which is also benchmarking the European GDPR. They had a challenge. Listen, they are a G20 country. They have a challenge, and this challenge is very, very simple. How can you balance between your national interest and the data of your own citizens, / bringing international companies who are very reliant on cross-border data? Did they hit it with that? I think we'll see. I think what we're gonna keep an eye on is how companies are gonna react to that. What are their responses? How this is going to affect their own joint ventures, their own local footprint in the Saudi market in the next 2 years. And the best thing about data, it's immediate results. Let's wait for 5 years to evaluate. No, I'm going to tell you, this can be next year, because the law was just, we did an amendment that was just confirmed or released last week or 2 weeks ago. So right now it's in place. So let's see how this is going to impact the Saudi market in the next year.
This has really been a concise and informative discussion, Mohammed. So let's move to not your most recent, but something you wrote for MEI, and that's time for a Saudi-U.S. tech dialogue. Because we see the global competition between U.S. China, and we see at the regional level and G20 countries, middle powers, as it were, trying to work in this environment and trying to succeed and preserve their tech and digital sovereignty, as you called it. What do you mean by it's time for a U.S. Saudi tech dialogue?
As a Washington insider, as someone who is part of the Washington echo chamber, I think we're still stuck back in the 1990s with Saudi Arabia, meaning we still think that oil for security framework is the right framework. I don't think so. I think this is a very, very, very outdated framework to think about the relationship for simple reasons. I would say, number one, America is the biggest oil producer in the world right now. That's a fundamental fact. So that means our perception of the Gulf is different. There's a difference between the United States as a security guarantor based on the fact that the United States is the biggest energy consumer client in the 70s and 80s, some extent in the 90s, to today where the United States is the biggest oil producer. So that changes some of the aspects of the relationship. Number two, this is not Saudi Arabia of the past. This is a G20 country, and I think I always stress on this fact. A G20 country, it's a bit different than just being a Gulf country or a Middle East country. It's a country that's part of an emerging, I would say, 10 economies that are going to play a decisive role in this new economic dynamics on the global level. It's Brazil, it's Nigeria, it's India, it's Indonesia, it's Saudi Arabia. So they're thinking differently. They're thinking about positioning not only from a Gulf standpoint or Middle East standpoint, they're thinking about themselves from a global standpoint. So when you have these two different dynamics in the same place, oil for security doesn't really work. You have to think about the relationship differently. I'm not saying oil and security are not important. Just to make sure I'm saying this correctly. I'm not saying they are not important. I'm saying it's not an encompassing framing for the relationship. So what should be the encompassing framing for the relationship? We need to think about Saudi Arabia as a G20 economy. We think about Saudi Arabia as a country that's going through a massive economic transformation that's unprecedented in the emerging markets. As you know, I don't really settle in one city. I travel all over. And the Saudi story is unique, meaning you don't see that massive transformation in a country like what we're seeing in Saudi Arabia right now. Part of it is size, part of it is own GDP, part of it is the budget allocated for this economic transformation. So from the way that they are reconstructing, redesigning their existing cities to the new cities, to thinking about civilian nuclear programs, to thinking about housing tech inside Saudi Arabia, to investing in critical/high-end tech overseas, to their own pivot to Asian markets in ASEAN. This is different. So we need to meet them where they are right now because this is their ambition. So, and we have a lot to offer, right? It's not really as like, well, just talk as just a policeman. America is more than a policeman in the Gulf. That shouldn't be the framing. The moment we're just, the United States is thinking about itself as just a policeman that's there for some only exclusively for security, I think this is a losing strategy for the United States, regardless of the administration. Tech transformation, this means where the United States is from this tech transformation from a national level. We're not only speaking about U.S. companies going to the Gulf. You also need to develop some sort of a tech-centric foreign policy in terms of how to think about data, how to think about investment in tech, how to think about talent. The question of talent is very important. How to think about other elements of tech cooperation, meaning electrical vehicles, low orbit space, low orbit satellite. And these are clear advantages for the United States, clearly. People like American tech. The problem is sometimes American tech is not really accessible because of local grounds. I'm going to be very... so we need to rethink about that. Because if we're not really thinking about that, we're going to lose ground. Because you cannot really, and this is what happened with 5G. You let go of the 5G battle from the beginning. You didn't invest. You didn't have your own alternative. So eventually you wake up to the fact that China is dominating the 5G network with more than 50% of the market share based on pure economics, right? All these countries, when they went to Huawei and ZTE to get their 5G equipment, it was purely economics, meaning it's 40%, 30% cheaper than Sweden and Finland, Nokia and Ericsson. Clearly, I'm going to go to Huawei if I'm a policymaker that are thinking about the national interest and economic interests of my people. So this is what we should also think about. You should not really let go of the space and then have concerns or be mad that people are not really coming to you for your own tech anymore.
You touch on so many things that are themes on the 966. One is, update our perspective and our framework on how we want to interact with Saudi Arabia and many of these countries. The other, and I think it's a big one, is if it's a competition, we can compete. And I was really encouraged. We did a segment last week, Lucian, on the discussions that Bill Burns, the head of the CIA, was out in the region in Saudi Arabia, and also Jake Sullivan, NSA director, had a phone call with the Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, and the readout was really interesting to me. And you probably didn't notice this, but they specifically talked about Open RAN
and 5G and 6G as well.
Yeah, and they talked about clean energy. All areas that we should be engaging full bore with Saudi Arabia. Are you seeing a shift in the way people look and interact with Saudi Arabia in terms of U.S. policymakers?
I love what you just mentioned. I think I think the clear example of there is some sort of a change in Washington in the way they see Saudi Arabia, I think, was last year when President Biden visited Jeddah, when he came here to town. When you look into some of the statements and some of the MOUs that were signed, it was about Open RAN, 5G, 6G, space cooperation, clean energy cooperation. And the fact that you have that in writing, it's also very telling about how Saudi Arabia is trying to say, this is how we want you to see us. We're not only here for oil. Oil is going to be here for what, a generation, 2 generations, but we're also thinking about this century differently. So we want to think with you about space policy, right? I mean, remember, the UAE just launched a mission to Mars. It was the 6th country on Earth to send a mission to Mars, in cooperation with the United States, by the way, right? So this is where Saudi is and thinking. They're thinking about Open RAN, and they're not thinking about Open RAN as the how somehow sided with the United States. Not really. Open RAN is more about sovereignty. Open RAN is more about opening up the ecosystem. We also want our own companies to be part of this. We also want to build our own capability in-house. And this we should encourage. Having countries that are much more independent in terms of these sort of critical technologies and infrastructure is actually beneficial, because the United States has been saying for the last 20 years, I would say since the second term of George Bush, President Obama, President Trump, and right now President Biden, we want burden sharing. This is part of burden sharing, by the way. Burden sharing is not really just spending. Burden sharing also means technology, and means R&D, and means investing in local capability, and means more cooperation in these sort of fields. So I see from that sort of standpoint, if you are thinking and calling for hedging and partners and allies playing a much more bigger role in their own defense and security, this is part of the framework.
Fascinating. This is so in keeping with so many things we want a platform on the 966.
Yeah,
and I think it's really timely, Mohammed, that you're talking about tech, because it is first and foremost for Saudi Arabia. They're putting in data centers, they're putting in subsea cables. Everything is about tech driving forward. And trying to make their way in this sort of more conflicted, more antagonistic global power environment is a tremendous challenge. I really don't have anything to add, because I think we just pushed, as we say sometimes here, we just pushed start, and this was a tremendous overview of the environment and the challenge and the potential for the U.S. to be involved in this evolution in Saudi Arabia and the region. And a lot of, as you say, it's not just Saudi, but there are middle powers. There's Brazil and Indonesia and India and Nigeria, all these countries that are trying to make their way in this very fraught environment. And we can plug in maybe more constructively than we have in the past.
100% agreed. And I think this is why I was very excited about leading the tech program for the Middle East Institute. I felt that it's the right time, the right field, the right framework. And I think I'm very happy about the work we do. And I'm very happy that you read the pieces that you mentioned in detail, because I think we're doing a good job trying to highlight how the relationship should be for the 21st century.
Well, and speaking of that, we always want to be cognizant of other organizations that we think are doing great work. And Middle East Institute is doing good work. They're hiring people like you, but also, across the board, there's some really talented analysts and experts. So we love to see that, because obviously we benefit from it because we get to feature them.
Very kind of you. I will deliver the message to our leadership.
Mohammed Soliman, Director of the MEI Strategic Technologies and Cybersecurity Program. Thank you, Mohammed. This was wonderful. We appreciate it.
Thank you, gentlemen.